Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on co-designing online platforms for sensory processing. My name's Hayley Green from Autistica, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. I'll be joined by the AutSPACEs team, Bastian, Georgia, Susanna and James. For those of you who are new to us, Autistica is the UK's leading autism research and campaigning charity. We exist to create breakthroughs and that enable all autistic people to live happier, healthier, longer lives. We work with autistic people, fund research and shape policy to make sure the evidence generated through research has real-world impact. A big part of that is sharing the latest research and evidence-based practice, which is what all of these webinars are about. And so to our main event, I'm delighted to hand over the webinar to the AutSPACEs team.
Hi everyone, it's really wonderful to be here. And thank you to everyone who answered this question. It's a really important topic because actually autistic people are much more likely to experience discrimination and abuse online as well as exploitation. And so one of the key themes of this webinar is going to be how do you create an online space that is safe and welcoming for autistic people in the context of a project called AutSPACEs, which we're all members of here, Susanna, James, Bastian and myself. So AutSPACEs is an online platform which has been co-designed with the support of autistic people, and it's a place where we are investigating sensory processing. It started as a collaboration between Autistica and the Alan Turing Institute. So myself and Bastian are members of the Alan Turing Institute, and James and Susanna are community volunteers who have gone on to lead really important aspects of the project. So they're co-leaders of the moderation strategy for the AutSPACEs platform. I'm going to give a very quick background and overview of what AutSPACEs is, to put some context to the question of how do you create an online space which is both safe and supportive of autistic people and able to collect research. And then I'll hand over to Bastian, who will talk to you about the methods and the approach that we took, then over to James, who will go through some of the dilemmas that we encountered when we tested with different people. And finally, Susanna will talk about the AutSPACEs approach, so some of the strategies and solutions we came up with and the next steps. So, background. Depending on the study, this number varies, but around 90% of autistic people process sensory information differently compared to non-autistic people. And this can lead to a huge number of difficulties and challenges, not because there's anything wrong with processing senses differently or inherently wrong with autistic people, but because our environments and supports are not necessarily well designed for those differences. So actually, the research that we're doing is in order to meet these two research questions to investigate them further. These came out of a priority setting exercise run by Autistica in 2016, and they consulted over 1,000 autistic people, researchers and their families, and these questions: which environments and supports are most appropriate in terms of achieving the best life outcomes for autistic people, and how can sensory processing in autism be better understood, were some of the top 10 questions for autism research according to that group. AutSPACEs stands for Autism Research into Sensory Processing for Accessible Community Environments. So it's a research collaboration between these institutions. So the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. Autistica, you're all here at an Autistica webinar, and is a UK research charity that specialises in supporting autistic people to take part in research and making sure that it's based on autism advocacy. And Open Humans is an international organization which helps people have control over their data that they can then use in different research projects. So what we want to do with this platform, when I say platform, it's basically a website. And what we're using it for is getting people who have sensory processing differences who are autistic, or who know somebody autistic, they can support them to use the platform as well, to share their stories of how they're affected in their daily lives by those differences and what kind of environments work well for them and what don't. So it's basically a website where we're collecting people's stories, and this experience here is an example of one of the stories we would collect. But it's also a community of autistic people, their supporters, researchers and developers. The entire website is co-created, so this community has been involved extensively in the design of the website, in the design of the moderation strategies, in the design of how we run the research itself. And a citizen science platform basically means that we are collecting research from lots of different people who are not professional scientists, but are involved in the research process itself. So we're trying to collect together all of those stories so we can understand better what kind of environments would suit autistic people and how can we build those or manage those to support autistic people's flourishing. We take a nothing about us without us approach. This originally comes from disability advocacy. As well, we take the social model of disability approach, where we believe that there's nothing wrong with a person, there's only things wrong with the society that disempowers those people. So it's more than just co-design, it's co-ownership. The people who have been involved in the focus groups, in the user testing, in the design, should own the platform and feel a sense of ownership and have the actual ability to set direction and determine how the research is conducted. This is a principle which is not, unfortunately, so widespread in research, although it's getting much more traction. It's really about making sure that we can build from, so if you have a community kind of consultation or meeting or a group that has a limitation on how much time it can take, with a citizen science platform, you're able to reach more people and there's more flexibility in terms of they can use it whenever they want to use it. So creating this website is a way of getting research at scale that is still community-led. So we've taken a number of different approaches. Scoping sessions first. Part of the reason for the scoping sessions was to understand how people wanted their data to be managed, so that then we could start to collect it in a way that was fair and reasonable, respecting people's privacy, but also collecting enough that it was useful. So then we held more extensive focus groups in order to, we've actually published that data on our website where we're building AutSPACEs. So we've collected a lot of people's opinions about how the research should be run, and that is informing our approaches. And we've also done lots of one-to-one working, group meetings, online co-working sessions, and community meetups. So there was one of those today. It takes an hour and a half, and it's a whole range of people. Different people turn up each time. So that's a really useful way of people being able to have some direction setting and decision-making power throughout the research cycle. So we have three main goals. We're using the website to collect these stories. The first one is to share those stories and adaptive techniques with others who have similar experiences. So we have a section which is recommending or recommendations for what would have made an experience better. And that's so that others can learn from those if they have a similar set of sensory kind of challenges that they face, but also so that we can educate neurotypical people to better support their friends, family, and colleagues, because there can be a huge lack of understanding and stigma around autistic people's experience. So this makes sure that that's available information for people who want to help. And finally, once we've collected enough data, we can advise organizations on how they can design and adapt spaces to improve people's lives. So maybe we need to build things differently, maybe we need to manage spaces differently. Maybe we need to adapt spaces that already exist so that they're more suitable for autistic people. One of the really important aspects of involving a community and building a research platform like AutSPACEs was that like quite substantial aspects of the research can change, including these changed goals and scope. So having this recommendation where people can then provide their own solutions and strategies and share that with their others who are using the platform became a really important aspect. This means that autistic people can support other autistic people, and it becomes a kind of peer-to-peer support. We also have a huge amount of emphasis on data sharing and agency. This was another thing that came out of our scoping and focus groups as a high priority. We give people complete control over who they share their data with. So you can share it with researchers, you can share it publicly, both or neither. And this is very easy to change as well. And you can do it for each story that you submit. So you can have a different choice for one that you think is too sensitive to be public, but you want for research. And then another one you might think is useful to people, so you want it to be public. So we say fine-grained, dynamic and informed consent. Dynamic just means you can change it. Fine-grained means that you have a lot of specific control, and informed means that you understand what's going to happen with the data, and that's all very available on the website. All that information is there. And we also moderate public experiences to keep everyone safe, which returns back to the question that this started off with. This is a research project designed to address what are spaces like in the built environment and how can we make those better for autistic people. But of course, online spaces are spaces too. And often they are not well suited to autistic people because autistic people can be vulnerable to certain kinds of discrimination and abuse online. So we wanted to make sure that AutSPACEs is somewhere incredibly safe, that people can go where they feel comfortable, and that it's an autism first space. So this little quote captures this question of why moderate. This is a verbatim quote from someone in one of the focus groups. I think you have to work on the basis, unfortunately, that every single corner of the internet which doesn't have moderation just seems to fill up with Nazis. They're everywhere and it happens in the most unlikely places. So I would say at least for the first couple of times, you need to moderate the users. So moderation is incredibly important because we can't have people who are prejudiced, discriminatory, have these kind of attitudes, talking over, abusing, or creating an environment which does not feel safe and supportive for autistic people using it. That was our major priority. So here are some findings from papers which show that autistic people often do use online spaces to socialize, make friends, have connectedness and interactions with others, but also that there's the dangers to people's mental health and other kinds of danger online, which means that we have to be really, really careful about the kind of online space that we can create, but also that there's a huge amount of potential for that online space to be really useful to autistic people if we get it right. So moderation is a hugely important aspect of building a website that we'll use for research. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bastian, who's going to talk to you about our methods.
Thanks, Georgia. So if you move to the next slide, we had three big goals for designing the moderation that we thought AutSPACEs really needed to hit all three of them. The first goal was to really create a welcoming, inclusive, and safe online space for autistic people, so that people would feel comfortable sharing their experiences around sensory processing, but also to make sure in general that we do not do any harm with the research we are doing or the platform we create. So we definitely don't want to create anyone any harm. So we wanted to be very clear on that. But of course, the platform also wants to allow people to share their challenging experiences. After all, we do expect that because society and our environment is built the way it is, that people face challenging sensory processing experiences, and not just great sensory processing experiences where things go well, because things go wrong, and we want people to share these spaces. And this ultimately leads to this problem that we really need to, or this challenge that we need to balance these complex needs of the community, both around which things are acceptable, how do we treat these challenging experiences, and how do we give people, in a way, agency and choice? How do you as a user or I as a user decide which things I want to see, which things I don't want to see? And probably for each of us, these trade-offs are slightly different, what we are comfortable reading and what we are not comfortable reading. So for doing this, we took, as Georgia already mentioned in the summary, if you go to the next slide, like a very diverse approach of methods of really working with the community of people that we wanted this platform to use. So we had like different stages of the research that we started out with an initial scoping session where we really just did basically focus groups and invited people before the pandemic to even come to the Institute to just sit down and talk us through their feedback, what they would like to see from the platform, which types of data we should collect, how we should collect it. And that's also really where the initial focus on moderation came to be, where people said this is a really important topic, and Georgia showed you one of the quotes from one of these sessions. And based on this, we engaged in further co-design sessions where we engaged both the software developers, us as researchers in the larger research community, lots of autistic people, as well as their relatives, carers, and so on, to co-create this platform with us. And if we go to the next slide, we really use different methods for this. So I mentioned we already held focus groups, we built a user personas, so we came up with like some idealized versions of fictional people that we envision would use AutSPACEs as a platform. So it would be someone who is autistic and had a challenging sensory processing experience. It could be a friend, family member, co-worker of autistic people that might want to read about the challenges their friends, family members, and so on experience to better understand the challenges they face and how they can support them, and so on. So based on this, we thought about which are the people we really want to prioritize. And I think we agreed based on this very strongly that like the initial focus would be really on autistic people should be able to comfortably use this platform as the main target audience for our research. And then together with James and Susanna, we really like did a lot of work on reviewing and consolidating existing frameworks around moderation, the challenges faced with moderation, and so on. And also in these monthly community meetups that Georgia already mentioned as well, and we just had one today, engaged a wider community for feedback. So whatever ideas we had and that we thought we had consolidated, we fed back to the larger group of the AutSPACEs community to ask them for input. And of course, last but not least, we also, being researchers and engaging collectively between the four of us in this research, reviewed the academic literature and moderation best practices that we could find out there. And I think based on both the academic research and the community feedback, we really found some interesting challenges or dilemmas. And I think James will now talk you through those.
Yes, Bastian. Unfortunately, my camera is not agreeing with Zoom, so you'll just have to have my voice for this one. Apologies. So yes, as Bastian mentioned, there are some significant dilemmas and choices that we needed to make regarding our moderation approach that I will go into. Next slide, please. Yes. So major challenges, and really at the crux of this is a challenge about how we can meet users' freedom of expression. Particularly important because obviously this is a research site, and we want this to be a site where people can kind of we can develop as good and robust research base as possible, whilst also adhering to the project's ethos of a safe and inclusive environment. And finding this balance between inclusivity and authenticity is really the key challenge that we've had when developing our moderation approach and taking choices over what sorts of language, situations, behaviors are and aren't allowed on the platform. So we're now quickly going to go to a Slido poll where we will ask the question, what should we moderate for? And it'd be really good to get a sense of people's views over what should and shouldn't be allowed on the platform. So we'll have a couple of minutes for that. I think perhaps it's now slowing down. So I'm still going. But yeah, I think there's a really interesting range of inputs here. I think obviously there are some obvious ones. So obviously hate speech is a big one, trolling, bullying. I mean, I think that's all kind of fairly obvious. Threats, stuff that is very easy and quite obvious. I think there's some interesting ones here around covert researchers. That is an interesting one. That's not one actually I think perhaps we've come across before. I think phishing and that sort of stuff. Yeah, that's quite obvious. I think there was some interesting stuff around kind of breach to confidentiality, identification of personal information. Libel is an interesting one, a little bit subjective, and anything that kind of gives the game away. Grooming, hopefully that shouldn't be an issue because I believe, Bastian, we're limiting it to over 18s. Although obviously there are still potentially some risks in that regard. And yeah, kind of things like obviously heated arguments. That's potentially an interesting area, and one which we regularly come across on the internet. So yeah, quite an interesting mix here, and I think it demonstrates some of the kind of considerations that we've had to take in relation to moderation strategy. And certainly in some situations, it's very, very obvious and very, very easy in terms of what is and isn't allowed. I mean, in certain situations, it's perhaps a little bit more nuanced and kind of challenging. So we can go into some of the kind of the key things that key considerations that we've come across in the next slide, and some of the key kind of arguments. So the moderator's trilemma, and this is the same for pretty much any moderation community, is you have a large and diverse user base. You have centralized and top-down moderation policies and practices, usually coming from kind of a central point. But you've also got to avoid angering large parts of that platform users who often are quite personally engaged in the forum or the website, and may have some quite different ideas around what is permissible and what is good on an internet platform. So these are kind of the key challenges that any moderator will come across. But we think we have developed an approach which is different and perhaps quite innovative, and has very much been based on the specific context that AutSpace exists in, with a very specified community of autistic users, who are, we would hope, approaching the kind of platform in the right way. A community co-designed and controlled moderation policy and practice, which has been developed with autistic users throughout its design process, as Georgia spoke about, and some really careful considerations around balancing priorities to meet user needs. So we can go a little bit more into some of the challenges. So we can see here, one of the big choices we've had to make is on commenting on others' experiences. For example, underneath a kind of a post, you might have the opportunity to comment or feedback. And there's a debate here because obviously, on one hand, people, we've had good feedback saying that it will encourage goodwill because it will encourage people to give feedback. But obviously, we are acutely aware of that. There is the strong possibility of arguments of abuse, and also people questioning the lived experiences of users, which is quite, could be quite kind of difficult. And I think on balance, we've taken the decision that we will not be having commenting under posts for that reason. It's not really the sort of platform where we would want to kind of have that kind of debate and people pushing back. And we think probably the risks outweigh the benefits here. But it is one of the key choices we've had to make in the development of the platform. And we can obviously see a lot of the risks that can arise with below the line comments on many sites these days. Next slide, please. Triggering content. And I think this is a really, really big challenge because obviously we want this to be an authentic and accurate site. We do not want people to be telling their experiences kind of as truthfully and as accurately as possible. But there's obviously a risk, that a lot of things that happen in the real world are not nice, they're not pleasant, and they may be triggering to people. So there's a real debate here over what you over the potential censorship of lived experiences and content. As we can see here, people have said, well, in certain situations, people writing about abuse or writing about suicide attempts, those are potentially going to be triggers for others that might kind of be quite damaging. So we do have a duty of care there. But as said before, sharing stories is often really powerful, and awareness is really important. And obviously, there are some potentially, if you are in a situation where you have a story you want to tell, and then you were to get it taken down or kind of curtailed, that could be quite upsetting as well. So some really nuanced kind of considerations there. And we've got some kind of interesting potential design innovations that Susanna will talk about subsequently in the next section. Next slide, please. And then finally, reporting on behalf of others. So one of the kind of audiences who potentially will use AutSPACEs are parents of autistic children and adults who may be reporting on behalf of their children. And in that situation, that's a really nuanced thing, because in some situations, some autistic people may not be able to use the platform and communicate on the platform. So there's the argument that actually in those situations, those people's experiences would never be heard if the parent didn't have the ability to use the platform. But on the other hand, there is a potential risk that those people may not actually be communicating, may not be actually speaking kind of fully on behalf of that child, and also that it may make the platform less welcoming to autistic people, because actually it could become a situation where you have a lot of neurotypical people who are monopolizing space on the platform, but is obviously primarily about autistic people. So there's some quite careful considerations there as well about whether people report on behalf of others. So I'm now going to hand over to Susanna, who will talk about some of the moderation interventions that respond to some of these dilemmas.
Yes, thank you, James. So the first sort of, I guess, thing that we've put in place to make this as safe a space as possible is that all posts will be pre-publication reviewed. So it's not like you upload it to the system and then once it's uploaded, it gets checked. Nothing is posted without being checked by a moderator beforehand. So this reduces risk to the users, gives moderators more time to contemplate, and helps maintain that AutSPACEs ethos of having less risk and equaling higher standards. So really, next slide. And we've created a moderation system, as James mentioned, and some guidelines along with rules that focus on transparency and equitability, whilst allowing negative experiences to be shared, while still minimizing the risk to vulnerable readers. So the big question is, well, how have we done this? How have we allowed people to write about these negative things without risking the mental security of others? And it's pretty brilliant in my opinion, but then again, I came up with it, so I may say that. So we move on. You can see here we have a traffic light system. So red means that it breaks the COC or code of conduct and will not be approved for public sharing. So that could be that there is certain terminology that we are just straight out saying, no, that's not appropriate for this site. It could be that that's mentioned, or simply that it's not discussing sensory processing and therefore it's not relevant to the site. Green means that it meets all requirements, all good. And amber means it doesn't break the COC, however, it contains potentially triggering content, so will be flagged. And the way that this has been implemented into the actual system, the actual website, is really cool. So if we move on, you can see these are two screenshots from the current version of our website. So one has to physically opt in to view any posts that have been tagged with triggering content. So these are the categories that we've come up with. There is an other because we are aware that despite the fact that we are quite a large community that's been working on this, we don't know everything that is upsetting or everything that could be traumatic to other people. And even after you've opted in to see that, so you can see this example person has opted in to see drug and alcohol misuse being mentioned in posts, it is still flagged. So that means even if on that day you don't necessarily want to read it, you don't have to. It's always flagged even after you've opted into it, as being amber, as containing that triggering content. So next slide. As James mentioned, we've decided not to have comments on our site, and this puts less pressure on users to seek that social approval, because research has shown that autistic people in particular can gain a lot of confidence and a lot of benefits from having those positive reactions when they post on social media, but the opposite also occurs when they don't, particularly for those whose sort of main form of interaction is online. It also avoids prejudice and discrimination, increases the safety, allowing people to share vulnerable and personal experiences. And if honesty, it just makes it much simpler for our moderators. All our moderators will be volunteers, so having to only moderate posts and not every single response we get to each and every post, it just makes life simpler for them too. So next slide. So James mentioned there what was probably our biggest dilemma, which was sharing on behalf of others. We want all autistic voices to be heard. However, we want to retain that sense of authenticity. How can we prove that what a parent says about their child is actually genuine? Well, we can't. Perception is a large part of the way that we see things. So we've come up with a guideline system that emphasizes autistic voices first and addresses those concerns that a lot of our the autistic people in our focus groups had, while still allowing the high needs autistic users to be heard. So next slide. So you can see the way that we've done this is we've got a whole section in the COC just for this, and we've kind of approached it rather than by putting out a list of rules. We've put out some questions so that the person writing on behalf of someone else can really think about what it is that they're writing, and check whether they believe it's all factual or not. So can the person who you parent or care for write about or share their own story? Are you making any assumptions or inferences about the autistic person? Are you adding any subjective or personal details which are not your own? And admittedly, we do know that we have taken a sort of quite a drastic approach to this. It's very much an autistic person first point of view, and it is definitely something we plan to tweak in the future with feedback from parents of autistic people. But that's the beauty of projects like this. It is forever adapting, forever changing, because it's all open source, all growing all the time. So next slide. So yeah, this is sort of just, I think, a quote here. So it's better to write neutrally about the things you're observing, focusing on the experience of the autistic person that you're writing on behalf of, rather than focusing on your own experiences. And in particular, don't use this space for venting or complaining, because that was something that a lot of our autistic participants were very concerned about. So, for example, don't write, "I hate it when my autistic son makes a scene in the supermarket. It's so embarrassing." Instead, write, "My autistic son cried and stood still in a busy supermarket. Some people around us showed negative expressions and body language whilst this happens. This usually occurs when we go to the supermarket." So there, you're not putting any of your own personal emotion into it. You're not sort of assuming why your son is making a scene. You're just stating what is happening and what your experience in that environment has been. So moving on. So here we have quite a busy but a pretty cool diagram that shows sort of the system and how posts or stories, as we call them, will go through in order to be approved or disapproved. So if I can talk you through it very quickly. So an experience is sent to the moderation database, and the moderator will then be assigned, and they read through it. Does the submission contravene with the code of conduct? Yes, okay, it's labeled red, goes back to the user. They can edit it, resubmit it, or delete it. No, oh, that's great. Does it contain any triggering content? If the answer is yes, it will be labeled amber and published on AutSPACEs, only for those who have opted in to see that content. If the answer is no, be labeled green, published on AutSPACEs with no issues whatsoever, and everyone can view it, and it's all brilliant. So, basically, you can see how it works. It's pretty simple. And if we go back again to our next slide, which I believe is our snippet, our screenshots, you can see how that's implemented. So right here, this particular one about self-medication has gone through that system. It doesn't break the code of conduct. It contains potentially triggering content. So now it's on our site. It's labeled as amber. Only those who have opted in to see it can see it. And there's no risk of people scrolling through and accidentally coming across something that they find upsetting. So what are the next steps now that we've put this all in place? Well, obviously we intend to launch the platform, but before then we need to co-create our training materials and resources for moderators and then recruit them. The aim is that at all times at least 50% of moderators will be autistic, because as we've said throughout, we want the autistic voices to be heard first. People with autism are at the core of this entire project. And the moderation process will remain open and will be altered, throughout the whole process. Any issues that occur, we will change as time goes on, because that's just what this project is. So thank you to all of our community members for making this happen, especially Kirsty Whitaker. And yeah, you can find us on GitHub. I'm sure somebody can put that in the chat. And you can read the preprint of our paper also if you want to. And the link of that will also go somewhere in the chat. So thanks again. Time for Q&A and discussion.
Thank you everyone for sharing your work. That was all really interesting. We'll now move on to the Q&A session. We've already had some really interesting questions. If anybody has any more questions, please add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so the first question is, will the website have mental health signposting?
I can make a first step at that, and then whoever else from the team wants to chime in, please just unmute and and do so. So I think that's partially what Susanna just showed at the end. So like part of the signposting is that like these warnings are there that people know, or they can opt into seeing potentially distressing things. By default, they are all hidden. No one needs to see any of these topics which potentially are problematic and might affect the mental health of the reader. And people can then opt in based on the topics, and then they will show up. I think additionally, maybe the second aspect, I'm not sure which, like the type of signposting being meant. I will try to also my second understanding would be whether there's like two resources that people need, and I think we do link out to resources, how to get support if you might need it, and so on. So there's that aspect as well. And I will pass it over to James. I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, no, we will have signposting to kind of mental health support resources, and I think Mind or one of those organizations. So yeah, that will be there will be that follow through if people feel they need it. I think we also discussed potentially a flagging tool or something, Georgia, at one point, but I don't know where we got to with that.
Yeah, so we wanted to make it very explicit what the platform is and isn't for, which is another element of the code of conduct, to show that it's not a place where you can really directly get mental health support. But at the same time, we've compiled a list of organizations that might be helpful to people who are needing some extra support that isn't part of what AutSPACEs provides. So we will have links to those on the website as well. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question? I just want to make sure we've answered the right kind of...
I think you covered both angles of what that question could mean. So yeah, definitely. Sounds really good that you have resources available to signpost people towards. So somebody else has asked, how will the traffic light categorization be applied? Will users see the colour text, or will it appear only for moderators?
So as you saw, essentially any content that's green is just there. It's just all good and dandy. Anything that is amber will have that tag on it, which is orange or yellow. I don't know. There's always a debate, isn't it? What color is amber? I think that we don't have an example of it here, but the way that we have set up sort of the moderation system, because we know that a lot of our moderators are going to be autistic, and because we want to cut out as much subjectivity as possible, the way that we've currently got it set up is that if it is marked as red, the moderator can highlight the part that is considered to be breaking code of conduct and directly link that back to the COC. So the user can see exactly what is wrong or inappropriate about their post and change that, and that hopefully makes it easier for people to edit and then get their posts approved. So it's sort of, I guess it's a visualization system to help people better understand, but it is more behind the scenes than it is physical, because anything that's green is just approved and anything that's red is just disapproved.
Yeah. That actually helps to answer the next question. The next question was, what feedback is given to a writer whose content is read? How is it done? So you're just saying about, like, yeah, telling them why it's been not approved and how, yeah. Have you got anything else to add to that question? I know you've already answered it, so absolutely fine if not.
No, I think it's really curious to get this question, because this was another thing that there was a lot of debate about. And it was quite hard to come up with a balance, because lots of people said, I would want lots of feedback about what was wrong with my post, maybe even support adjusting the post. And then other people were saying, as a moderator, I feel uncomfortable being sort of personally having to have this kind of interaction with someone if it was potentially hateful speech, for example. So the compromise, I suppose, or the balanced kind of solution that we came to was this one of having the information that directly links to the code of conduct, because that's depersonalizing it. You know, it's not a sort of individual moderator making a specific judgment, sort of that, or victimizing anyone, or taking some kind of subjective exception to something. It's based on the rules that everyone has access to, so it can be really universally applied. So they can have that information without it getting too personal. James, I see your hand is up. Is it still up, or do you have an extra thing?
Well, I guess I just to obviously flag that the kind of the code of conduct will be obviously under review. So I think we're very much of the view that the code of conduct, its implementation, is inevitably going to, when it hits reality and operationalization, going to need to change and adapt to the situations it finds itself in, because there are obviously going to be things that we haven't kind of fully considered, or situations that are just kind of going to be new to us. So it is very much a situation where we're going to be kind of under a position of continuous learning, and also very keen as well for moderators themselves to kind of feel like they have the support and the recourse to be able to kind of like question moderation decisions, and make sure that kind of they're feeding back into the wider sort of policy, because I think we're really conscious that inevitably, this is going to be a very malleable piece, and it will need to change and adapt over time.
Yeah, and I think I just sort of to clarify sort of how we came to this decision of having this sort of almost direct linking, was that we were very aware that, you know, people with different cognitive abilities, different understandings, different perspectives are going to be using this site. And so we didn't want to just tell them, no, this breaks code of conduct without context. But there was a concern that if we started some kind of chat or some kind of conversation between moderator and user, not only could it potentially become quite aggressive if someone didn't fully understand, you know, well, I don't think that's abusive, or I don't think that's rude. But it, you know, this is very much a forum, not a, you know, a back and forth place like Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And there was a concern that people then almost might start using that chat to get extra support, and that's not what the moderators are there for. So that's sort of how we came to this sort of in between of having that direct feedback that takes you straight back to the code of conduct, which, you know, we've made sure is worded in as simple a form as possible. But it's and it also keeps it objective. And I guess it also helps because, you know, as much as we love our code of conduct, we've spent 2 years working on it, we can't guarantee that everyone's going to read it.
I wonder, guys, I wonder whether, because I wonder whether it would be possible to share our code of conduct with the group at some point, maybe after the session. I would have thought people might be quite interested in seeing it.
I can probably do that now. Haley, you were just talking, but you are still on mute.
It's okay. I was asking James if he wanted to speak and he did, so that worked out fine. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I'm sure Mercedes can set that up for you. And for everybody, if anybody watching is interested in seeing that. Okay, so someone's wondering, if you can't comment on posts, can the autistic community still communicate with one another on the platform?
So I think I can try to answer this, because the short answer is no. Like, there is no direct communication between people sharing experiences, but of course the website will be designed, or already like is designed, and once it's live, people will be able to share these stories other people have posted in different other places. So if you find a story that like, or like a recommendation of what could have made this experience better that you think would be of interest to someone else, you can share the link on email, Twitter, Facebook, whatever you're using to communicate with other people, to point them there. But then again, on the website itself, it's just to read it, and there is no feedback mechanism to partially also avoid that people accidentally identify themselves. That's like one big risk. So like part of the screening and the code of conduct includes also making sure that there is no personable identifiable information of the people sharing the experience. If they give the name of their place of work, or like things like this, like the name of their teacher was another example I think that came up in our focus group. So things like this, to make sure that everyone's privacy is respected. That's one of the main reasons to not also allow the back and forth, in a sense.
I would just say that based on some of the feedback we've got from our first user testing, this is something that we're currently discussing further. We had our monthly meetup this afternoon, and this was something we went over, because it does seem that people want a level of incentive to be posting, and to a lot of people, feedback is something that incentivizes posting things. So it's definitely something we're sort of questioning at the moment, and we're trying to sort of decide, is there a safe way to have interactions on this site or not? Because overall, it does seem that the cons outweigh the pros of any kind of feedback system. You know, if people are consistently looking to see, well, how many likes did my post get, hasn't got any, then that can have a very quickly have a very negative effect on them. And there's also the fear that if you know posts get likes or don't, then it could alter what people are writing about, and consequently affect the authenticity of the information that is being shared. So it's something we're discussing, but at this moment in time, there's no feedback or discussion options.
It sounds like a really safe space for autistic people to express themselves. So definitely something to like guard that safe space. So next question, would you use AI for moderation, such as flagging antisocial words?
Can I come in on this? So, I mean, it's something we could definitely consider in future. But I think my feeling on this is that AI, considering the scale of the platform, which probably, unless it's a wild success, is probably going to be relatively small, but also AI is often a really blunt instrument in terms of being able to identify kind of harmful words and things like that. But you know, it may not be particularly suited to this platform, particularly if we think about the authenticity question. People may use kind of bad language, or they may kind of utilize situations in their examples that are quite difficult or upsetting, and that may be flagged by the AI as a kind of a potential amber or red. And in that situation, obviously, the nuance of a human moderator with kind of subject matter expertise is probably the better solution in this space. But that's obviously, you know, the way the technology develops in the future, and as the platform scales, you know, it may not be. It may be that the situation changes. Georgia.
Yeah, so just very quickly, there's evidence that AI has a kind of double negative effect on marginalized communities. So one of the negative effects is that it tends to over-moderate marginalized communities. So it can actually misinterpret things that are said by those communities as being improper or inappropriate when they're not. And it can also let lots of things pass which are offensive because it doesn't have all of the context that's necessary. So it like James says, it is a very blunt instrument. Yeah, and as Mark is saying, it wouldn't pick up on specific nuances for autistic communications, and particularly because a lot of autistic people have this experience of being expected to communicate in a particular way, which is pretty arbitrary. It's just a kind of neurotypical set of norms, and often suffer discrimination because they communicate in a different way. We wouldn't want any of that prejudice to affect people using the platform, and an AI might be more likely to do that than moderators who are sensitive to autistic people's needs in particular. But I know both Susanna and Bastian had more follow-up as well, so I will stop talking now.
Yeah, well, I think this is a very interesting concept for our project, particularly as we're working with the Turing Institute, because I think computer learning is intended to be part of the project somewhere along the line once it's more developed and we have more content, but not necessarily for this reason. And it's very tricky because when we were coming out with this sort of red and amber system, it was because we knew people were going to want to write about their negative experiences. And there is a significant difference between saying somebody called me a retard, sorry for using the word, and saying I was out with this guy and he was an absolute retard. You know, it's that direct use of that language versus recalling usage of that kind of language. So we actually accept the first as being amber and the second as being red. But it's very tricky sort of to explain to people what the difference between direct and indirect usage is, let alone a computer system. And because this is a platform where we do expect people to be writing about their negative experiences, a lot of the things that the computer system would be set up to look out for would actually be acceptable on our site. So it just makes more sense to keep it to the humans because it's a lot simpler.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. So what do you hope organisations such as service providers, social media platforms and other online communities could learn and implement from your platform?
I think it's... Oh, George, you want to go first? Your hand's up.
No, it's okay. Go for it, James.
So I think there's some interesting points here. So I think the scale challenge and the homogeneity of the use base means that this is, in a lot of ways, this is quite a different challenge, moderation challenge to your mass market moderation kind of platforms, say your Facebooks, your Twitters, etc. For those platforms, really the only way is a kind of a fairly blunt moderation approach and the application of automated solutions. Having said that, I think actually the solution we've developed regarding the kind of the red, amber, green model and the tagging of content, which might be harmful or upsetting to users, is something which can be relevant to larger platforms, and particularly to different kind of communities on those platforms who may not want to see particular types of content. So I think there's definitely some learnings there for larger mass scale platforms that can actually be applied more widely.
I mean, I'll just briefly say this is not the first sort of website that I've worked on for a disability community. And I agree. I think that is sort of our unique aspect, really, is the red, green, amber system. I think also we've looked very carefully at colors and stuff like that. It's still something that we are working on to make sure that it's not visually overstimulating in any way. That is something that a lot of sites are slowly starting to learn about. You know, I also have epilepsy, so even though I'm not photosensitive myself, there's something that often pops up in discussions within that community is, you know, scrolling and things automatically playing, or the fact that you have to make them play, kind of things like that. So, you know, those are things that we've been very conscious about the sensory aspects of our sites. Not everyone is, so maybe that's something that larger online websites can think about. But yeah, I think James actually covered it all pretty well.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the goals of the platform, with the research that we collect about how sensory processing affects people's lives. First off, when we first did the scoping sessions, we asked people, does the sensory processing affect your lives? And there was immense response of people saying, yes, it does. It affects it hugely. It's really hard to have changes made. I feel alone. Just, it became really apparent very quickly how important it was. And I think that there's a lot of excuses people use to not make environments suitable for autistic people. So one is it's too personal and subjective. Everyone wants something different. And one is this kind of one size fits all, and then not being actually flexible to people's needs and actually listening to what they're saying that they need. So gathering that information, if there were patterns where there would be an intervention that might make a difference to a lot of people, like having dimmable lights, for example, or quiet spaces, or particular ways of writing directions that makes that less overwhelming, then that could be an intervention that could support a load of people very simply, and it takes that kind of excuse away. And also just seeing the range of difference that there is likely to be as well, I think can help lots of people to understand that you can't have a one size fits all either. So it's about being flexible to people's individual needs, but also recognizing that there are changes that can be made to support others, and that could be all kinds of different spaces: universities, workplaces, online spaces, Zoom meetings, websites. So I think there's a huge amount of change that should be made, can be made, and hopefully by having these people's lived experiences collected together, the people who use the platform, that's going to be a really useful motivation for change and information to inform that change.
Thank you for that. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for all of your questions. They really do allow us to dig deeper into important topics. If you'd like to attend more webinars, you can sign up to the Autistica network. You'll also hear the latest in autism research, including how you can get involved. Just going to let Bastian speak. I can see he's got his hand up.
No, I just wanted to, because I saw there were 2 questions about the expected launch date, and I think it would be a missed opportunity to not flag that.
Yes.
we are currently in the process of doing the ethics submission and data protection submission inside the Turing Institute to get the approval for launch it, and we hope that will be done by the end of this year, beginning of next year. So we have a newsletter, which I think maybe one of us can also link in the chat, where people can subscribe to get the news whenever it's out. And we hope that end of this year, early 2024, it will be there for everyone to use and try. And we would love to get your input on it.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Bastian. It sounds like it's actually going to come around really soon. We're already at October. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to bring up during this webinar, we have the opportunity to get involved in some research by taking part in one of our current surveys. We have partnered with video gaming platform Roblox and charity Internet Matters to carry out a survey aiming to understand the benefits and challenges around gaming online for neurodivergent children. The survey is open to children and young people aged 11 to 17 who are autistic or have ADHD, with a section for parents to complete. And the link should be shared in the comments. All that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to the team for sharing their work with us today and for answering all of your questions so thoughtfully. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much. Good luck with the launch and have a great evening.